She was a friend. We didn't really know each other well, but she ran a flower shop, the kind of small business that most of us have interacted with at some point. And my fiance said, why don't we ask her to do the flowers for our wedding? And so I approached her and said, hey, I'd love to know more about what you do. Do you have a website? And she said, no, I don't have a website. And I said, okay, well, if you just give me your email, I'll send you an email about some of the things we're thinking about, and then we'll get together and we can meet and talk about flowers for our wedding. We'd love to have you help us out. And she said, well, I don't have email, but I'll be happy to meet. At which point my fiance, who didn't know better, said, well, Chris can help you with that stuff. And she said, oh my God, if you would help me get an email, if you would help me get a website, I would totally hook you up. Now, if you're planning a wedding, if you're thinking of planning a wedding, you should know that I have a really low value for flowers. But I have a high value for making sure that my soon-to-be, now my wife, is happy. And so I said, great, a hookup means I pay less on flowers that I don't have a high value for. So this will be awesome. And so I started work putting together their website. I put together a site like most of you would do. And then I did some things that probably you wouldn't do. They sent me 100 photos of all the different flowers, except the photos were crappy. And so I opened each one up in Photoshop and started touching them up, changing the lighting, cropping them differently, making them look good, because of course, I wanted the website to look good, right? This is the kind of stuff you can put in your portfolio later. And so I edited 100 photos and put them on the site. She wanted a slider on the home page, and in those days, I thought it was okay. I got the site put together, and I said, okay, now there's a form on the site, and it'll send you an email, but you don't have an email, so let's go get that configured. And I spun up the infrastructure to support her email. She said, well, there's 3 of us else in the business, and so I spun up 4 email addresses. And she said, but we don't have anything to get the email. And in those days, people used Outlook, and I said, no problem. So I went to her office to set up Outlook, except it turned out they didn't even have a network. So I set up the network. You can see where this is going, right? I set up the network, I got all the computers on a LAN, and then I installed Office, including Outlook, and configured Outlook to get the email. And we went to the website and put in a form and hit the button, and it went all the way into her email, and it showed up, ding, she had mail, and she was thrilled. And so then we went back into her office, and we sat down. And my wife and I started, or my fiance and I started showing her photos of the things we liked, the things we hoped for and dreamed for on our special day. And we were looking at these images and showing her the kinds of things we cared about, and she started putting together a quote. And when she was done, she said, okay, so that's $1,100. And I just waited, because I'd done all this work, and she's now going to hook me up. She said, let's just make it around 1,000. I touched up 100 photos, built a website, added a slider, configured Outlook, installed a LAN, and configured all the computers for $100. Why do I tell you this story? That's unprofessional WordPress. And I want you to know that anything I'm about to share over the next several minutes comes from the very same place that all of us have been in at some point. We've all had that place where we were doing things that weren't sustainable. We were all doing things that didn't make any sense, and we don't like to talk about those days. I celebrated our 10th anniversary this summer with my wife, and I'm glad that that was 10 years ago and not 2 weeks ago. Trust me, I still make stupid mistakes, but I won't make those mistakes again. And this morning, what I want to do is talk about professional WordPress. Does that make sense? Awesome. Well, I have a passion beyond WordPress. I love WordPress, although now it's my full-time job, so I have to figure out a new passion. But I have something that I like to do in my spare time, things that I like to spend my time in, engage in. I have a passion beyond WordPress, and it's called high performance. In fact, I care so much about high-performing teams, high-performing organizations, and high performers that 2-3 years ago, now 4, I stepped out of the work and said, okay, you know what? I have my full-time job, but I'm going to go get a master's degree just in this. Because I want to spend time reading and researching and writing about high-performing teams. And so I did, and I got to do tons of research, and I got to discover the high-performing dynamics related to firefighters or football players. But the group that was most interesting to me were ballet folks. And this morning, I want to talk to you a little about the ballet. Because unbeknownst to me, I don't know if you've ever been to a ballet, but when you watch ballet, if you watch ballet, even if you're changing channels and you happen to cut through and see ballet for just a second, there's a chance you might see women dancing on their tippy toes, even some guys. Now, there's a technical term for tippy toes. It's not that. It's not tippy toes. But when they get on their toes, it's called on point. And it turns out they have special shoes for that called pointe shoes. And the Royal Ballet in London spends over £250,000 on these shoes because these shoes are disposable. In New York City, the ballet spends over $500,000 on these shoes. In Australia, the Australian ballet comes in right about in between. And they create these shoes. They're all custom. I mean, when you enter the ballet troupe, you're an apprentice, and so you just get to try on different people's shoes, anyone's shoes that fit your size. But when you get into the core production, you get custom shoes. And you have a shoemaker. These are all shoes made by hand. And they go and they shape the shoe to fit you perfectly and what you want. And over years, you establish one kind of shoe. But the shoe will last on a training day, 1 day. And on a performance day, they will wear one pair of shoes for 2.5 hours, and that's it. But that's not what's impressive about the folks that do ballet and dance on their toes. What's impressive is how much work they put into preparing those shoes. You see, if you're going to put on shoes for a 2.5-hour ballet so that you can get up on point, would it surprise you to discover some people prepare their shoes after they've had custom-made shoes? They still prepare their shoes for up to an hour. Now think about that. These are professionals who spend up to an hour working through their own tools, their own infrastructure, so they can be a professional for 2.5 hours. And it makes you wonder, are we investing as designers and as developers? Are we investing as much into our tools, into our performance, into our professionalism as someone who dances on their toes? These are shoes that are disposable. In the best case, if you're in the core troupe, they last for a day. In the worst case, 2 hours. And yet they'll spend up to an hour working on them. And so as I studied this, as I looked at this and watched it, I thought, boy, there's some lessons for me out of this. There's some lessons for my teams out of this. I want to understand the tools they use. I want to understand what they do. And I want to know how that relates to what we're doing. You see, they use shellac to go in and they put it into some of the shoes to make them a little bit stronger. The shank, which is the part of the sole that actually keeps the base of the foot strong while they're up on their toes, that shank, they break it open so that you can get still the support, but the curve of the foot is what counts. When you're watching the ballet, you want to see every curve. They break the shank, they shellac it. The box, which is the very front of the ballet shoe, that sturdy piece that's kind of a flat on the toe, that box has to be reinforced, and so they'll sew and reinforce it to just make sure it's sturdy. They'll put on additional straps, and they'll actually contact the maker to define whether the lacing should be a kind of a lace or a canvas. And then they'll go in and they'll cut it. And they do all these things for an hour before a day of 8 hours of wearing pointe shoes, or in a performance day for an hour right before 2 hours of dance. And you think, man, that's a commitment. But if you talk to someone in the ballet, they'll tell you, I want to be able to dance for years. I need the support of a good shoe. I need it to be perfect. I don't know about you, but as a person who's running development organizations, I want my developers to have longevity. I don't want someone to run in, come and work for a year or two, and then bounce out. I don't want them to decide, well, I want to do something else instead with my life. I mean, if they want to go somewhere else, that's great. But if they want a year or several years, 10 years in the career, shouldn't I, as someone who is creating that context for them, be responsible to make sure that they are actually treating themselves like a professional? Isn't it my obligation to build an infrastructure and a culture and an organization that ensures that they can be treated and treat themselves like a professional? I think the answer is yes. And so the first question that comes up for me, as you watch as they cut part of the shank out so they can jump better, they're eliminating part of the shoe. Some folks will take the heel, the little bit of material that goes over the heel, and it goes up too high, and that has an impact on the way they bend, and so they'll just cut it off a bit. They're eliminating part of the shoe. And the question that I ask developers is, what is it you're doing that needs to get eliminated? And the question I ask those owners of agencies, even if it's a 2-person, a 5-person, an 80-person agency, is, what are you eliminating so that your developers and designers can be more professional? For me, one of the things I eliminate immediately is unreasonable expectations. Unreasonable expectations. I'm sure this doesn't apply to any of you, but there are places out in the world where a boss says yes to whatever so he can get the paycheck, and then turns around and tells a developer or designer they have this amount of time to do whatever it is that they've said yes to. Again, I know that doesn't happen to you. You have more discernment. You work at better places, and if not, see me afterward. Unreasonable expectations start very simply with the first email or the first phone call, and sometimes we're not even aware of it. A person sends us an email and says, hey, I'd like to talk to you about a project. What do we do? Especially in the early years, we reply right away. And they say, oh, thank you so much for that quick reply. They call us, we answer the phone, and we start talking right away. And they say, when can you meet? We say, well, I'm free later this afternoon. Do you realize that within 1 or 2 emails or with 1 or 2 phone calls, you have now communicated that you are willing at any given moment to drop whatever it is you're doing so that you can meet with them, so that you can do whatever they want? Now, I'm not telling you to delay or push them off as some sort of crazy marketing strategy. That's not my point. I don't want you to lie about your world, but let me be very clear. When you respond immediately, when you say I'm free today, instead of saying, well, look, we're working on some projects, but why don't we meet Thursday, or why don't we meet next Tuesday, or what have you, we're communicating a kind of expectation that leads to unreasonable requests. If you're a supervisor, if you manage teams, when you say yes without first going back and getting a clue of what this would really take, when you don't let your frontline developers or designers tell you what it will really take, and you say yes to unreasonable expectations, you're creating an environment where you cannot possibly hope your developers and designers will be professional. Again, this doesn't apply to you. I know none of you are like this, but in my past, I've written code that I've looked at, and literally as it shipped, I've said, that's the worst code ever. I can't believe I'm shipping it. I said it to myself, none of you have ever done that. But it's because there was an unreasonable timeline associated with it. And so the question is, if we take a lesson from the folks that cut away parts of their shoes to be professional, what are you willing to cut away in your world? One of the other things they do is they put those straps around and they connect one to another. They'll even use flames. I don't know if you were looking at the tools, but they'll take a lighter and they'll light it so that they can get it melted, and then they'll connect it and they'll tie it up and they'll say, okay, I now have the support I need to be able to jump. The bands will give me what I need. And the question is, what are you doing to connect with others? What are you doing to collaborate with other companies? It's easy to just think, oh, we'll just buy that company or we'll hire that person and we'll just bring it all in-house and do everything. But the reality is there's so much work and there's so many things going on that you could literally partner with several companies and deliver all the same value and not have to be in charge of everything. If you're willing, you can connect dots that haven't been connected before. At Crowd Favorite, we have offices in Romania. I just spent a week up there. But I know several US companies that will never ask anyone in Europe to write code for them, because they have this misunderstood notion that it all has to be done in their office, right there where they can watch it. What dots are you willing to connect? What relationships are you willing to build? I spend a lot of my time building relationships among companies, introducing people to each other, just because I want all of us to rise up. I want all of us to be better. And the way you get better is by making connections with other people doing amazing things. And you don't have to be upset that someone else is doing something awesome. You can cheer them on. There's more than enough room for all of us to do amazing things. But you have to be willing to connect, which means you have to be willing to look up. You have to be willing to stop looking right down at the very thing you're worried about or the thing you're doing and look up and say, what is the other people doing and how can I collaborate? Are you willing to do it? When you watch these folks work with their feet, what you discover is they have ugly looking feet. And they'll tell you, they're like, yeah, no, there's calluses, there's all this stuff. But here's the thing. They're like, all those calluses and everything else, they're there to support what we're doing. They're protecting our feet. And then they'll go and they'll put spacers between the toes. They'll tape up toes so they don't get blisters. And you watch all of that because they're saying, we need the support. And the question I have for you this morning is, what are you willing to do to support those you work with? I don't know if you've seen this website where you can go in and type a term in Google, and this website will actually generate this little animated dynamic that shows you what it would happen if you Googled it. And then when someone else asks you a question, you can send them the, have you Googled that stuff? And you send it to them. And it's the rudest thing I've ever seen in the world. You have people either right next to you or people that are connected to you online. Are you willing to take a second to coach the person next to you? Are you willing to take a second to say, you know what, the reality is, if I invest in someone else, there's a good chance I'll actually learn my stuff better. If I explain it, I may actually learn it stronger. And either way, I will develop those around me. There are those of you that think, no, you know what, here's the thing, I have to do it. I have to be in the part of it because I'm the only one that knows it. IBM now almost 20 years ago did a study and evaluated what it would take or what was the trade-off when you had to delegate something. And they were doing the analysis to figure out at what point does it no longer make sense to delegate? At what point is it worth keeping the task? And what they discovered was that the factor was 10x. If it took someone 9.5 times longer than you to do, it was still worth delegating. Some of you are doing the math right now and thinking, there's no way. But it's true. Because if you don't create opportunities for other people to learn, if you don't create opportunities for other people to have a shot at trying something, there's no way they'll get better. Are you willing to support the people that are coming alongside you? I told you about the box at the front of that shoe. It's where they stitch it up and make it really strong. They're going to put all their weight, an unreasonable amount of weight, on the very front of that toe and on the box of that shoe. What are you willing to do to reinforce the right culture, the right dynamic in your business? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to reinforce so that your staff and everyone in your team, whether it's 2-person, 4-person, 8-person, or 10-person team, understands the right rules and does the right stuff? For me, the highest value I have, and I know it's cheesy because we all have it, but at the end of the day, I care a lot about it. It's that every single employee have one and only one boss. Now, I know if I surveyed all of you and I said, hey, do you believe that every employee should have one and only one boss? Pretty much everyone would say yes. But if I mentioned to you that I had a hidden camera in your office watching you guys work, I'd discover that some of you don't believe the answer. We don't do it on purpose. We don't mean to do it. But what happens is an employee has a boss and then has someone who likes to come over and ask for something else, and then has a CEO who has a special project, and they end up with 3 or 4 bosses. And when you have 3 or 4 bosses, it's really easy to scapegoat things like, oh, it's not my fault, it's someone asked this or someone asked that. But when you do that, you no longer get the opportunity to own what you're doing. And if you no longer have the opportunity to own what you're doing, you also have no opportunity to have pride in what you're doing. And if you don't have pride in what you're doing, you won't go the extra 10%. And if you don't go the extra 10%, then the opportunity to generate the profit that you want in your organization disappears. Because what happens is you go not the 10% extra, you don't make it as performant, you don't cover it in tests, you don't do all the things you would do if you were proud of your work, and so it comes back to you and you have to fix it later. And that cost makes what you're doing completely unsustainable. And you have to decide, am I willing to commit to not having CEO special projects? I recently joined a company called Crowd Favorite. The CEO is a friend of mine, and I was on the board for a year before that. I didn't negotiate salary. I didn't care what he paid me. I liked the company, and I thought I could have impact. You know what I negotiated? That every single employee would have one and only one boss. What I negotiated was that there were no special CEO projects. And we had to talk about it 14 times before he said yes. Because what would happen is I would say, here's what I want. He'd say, yeah. And I said, no, let me give you an example. And then he's like, oh, wait, we're going to have to talk about that again. Until we got it clear. The reality is, if you don't reinforce the values that you have to make your organization professional, you won't treat yourself, and your team won't treat yourself as professionals. And how you treat yourself internally has an impact on how it works in the outside world and how other people see you. I won't go into this a lot, but the reality is you're going to have to break some rules. In the end, it starts with us. Our process. Our teams, how we think about our culture, our values, all those things. It starts with us. We have to treat ourselves as professionals first. There is a cathedral. This cathedral is known not only for having some amazing and beautiful stained glass, but it's one of the buildings among the top 10 that have taken the longest or took the longest to complete. It's the York Cathedral, and it took over 250 years to complete, 252 years to be exact. The reason it's so beautiful is because in taking that time, people were looking the long haul. And the question I have for you this morning is, are you willing to look, not in the short term, but for the long haul, to design an organization, to design a group, a team, the values and processes that will allow you to win in the end, to create something of beauty? I'm going to wrap up by saying what's good for your employees, what's good for you and your team, will ultimately be good for the client. And I know what's going to happen is you're going to say, well, wait a minute, because their clients want all sorts of things. Well, what's good for the client isn't always good for us. They want us to work all day and all night, and on weekends too. And all it'll make you do is be unhealthy. It's not helpful. I know some of you will say, well, wait a minute, hold on. The client's always right. Again, my boss, a Crowd Favorite, loves to say that. And I challenge him a bit to say, no, I agree with you mostly, right? Except it's the trained client that's always right. And my job is to train them, to make sure that their expectations aren't unreasonable. Here's what I know to be true. Everyone appreciates healthy boundaries. Oh, sure, a customer will call and say, I need you to do this right now. And I'll say, well, how long has this been an issue? Well, it's been an issue for 3 weeks. It's been an issue for 3 weeks, and suddenly it's an emergency? Can we wait a week? No, I need you to do it right now. Drop everything you're doing to do it right now. I said, hold on a second, because I'm working on someone else's project, and if I were to drop their project for you, then I got to ask you one and only one question. Are you going to be okay when I drop your work to help them? Well, no. I don't. That's not what. Hold on a second. That's not what I. Right. I have to hold my boundary on purpose. No one appreciates missed deadlines. So how you build your estimates and how you build your process ought to ensure that you won't miss them. My favorite, and the mantra that I teach everyone in our teams, is that account management means more than sending emails. Serious account management is one of the ways that we appear professional to the outside world. And how we communicate with others, the constant rate and the way in which we hold boundaries is critical. And often, a client shows up and starts talking about stuff and we think, oh, that's our client. But the reality isn't that. The reality is our client is our client's client. We're here to make our client look good. And I'll end by saying this. At the end of the day, I have tons of clients that have really stupid ideas. And I bet you have them too. I don't think this is just a US thing. And I'll tell you this. If I protect them from those silly ideas, they will gladly pay me for their good ones. That, to me, is what it means to be a professional. My name is Chris Lemma. You can find me at Chris Lemma on Twitter. I blog over at chrislemma.com, and I now work for a company called Crowd Favorite. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Please, line at the microphones or raise your hands.
My talks don't normally have questions at the end, so it's okay if you don't. If it takes you a while to figure them out, I'm going to head down to the... let me be very clear, I'm not an expert. Someone else named that bar that, but I'm going to head down to the expert bar if you want to hang out and talk some more. Don't have to do it here. Every company's approach is slightly different, and I know those questions are nuanced. But if you have a question you want to ask, go ahead.
Question in the middle?
Yeah.
Okay, so...
No, not you, Daniel. Sit down.
I have the mic. You have to listen to me.
Okay.
Okay, so if you have recognized a couple of mistakes or some of the things in your talk that maybe you're doing, where do you start? Where do you start in correcting some, training better clients, having better boundaries? What's a good first step?
My general take, as I mentioned before, is what's good for employees is ultimately good for the company, which ultimately becomes good for the customer. So I start internally. I start by going in and making sure that every single employee has one and only one boss. There's no cross-chatter, there's no cross-assignments. The lines are very clear. I also start immediately by adjusting how we think about expectations around estimates. Because the worst thing that a developer or designer feels is like they weren't listened to in that process. And so what happens is they say, well, it's going to take 10 hours, and some guy decides to write 5 hours on the sheet and send it out. And that's ridiculous. Right? You're a professional. If I want you to be a professional, I need to ask your professional opinion. Now, some people will, out of fear, say it's going to be 40 hours. And I have to have that conversation with them to really understand how much of that estimate is fear and how much of that estimate is reality. But if they can articulate exactly what they have to do and how long that's going to take, we're going to use that number instead because they're a professional, and I need to treat my staff as professionals so I can turn around and talk to our clients as a professional. So I'd start there.
Morning, Chris. Do you have any advice for companies growing past a stage where they don't have bosses in management to kind of having mid-management and...
Yeah. So the hardest part about growing is that you're layering in infrastructure after you've started, right? And everybody wishes they would have put the infrastructure in place first, and no one does, and so you end up just, you now have a new boss. And they're like, what's going on? So... one of the things I recommend, especially if you're small and you're starting to grow, is to start thinking long before you need that infrastructure, to start planning it and having conversations. And not just conversations among your executive team, conversations around the company. Because what you'll discover is that many employees are in the place of feeling like, yeah, there's a lot of chaos here and I don't want chaos, all right? So they will ultimately help you marshal in that infrastructure, but you need to start planning early. And some of my friends know this about me. I will plan things out 2 and 3 years in advance, right? It's just moving little pieces and taking little steps, because if I'm additive and I don't waste any energy, in the long run I'll get what I want a lot faster and easier and more economically. So in general, when you're talking about adding infrastructure to an organization, I'd say by all means go slow and start thinking about it in advance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.